What I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the book and Assignment China and some of the themes that arise and share some of the experiences of some of the people who are in the book, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So to begin, I want to hit the rewind button and go back 50 years to 1973, to my first trip to China. It's just 1 year after Richard Nixon's visit. That's me over there with the Mao cap and a lot longer and not gray hair. I was able to get on a trip with a group of American students, and one of the places we were taken was called the Wusan People's Commune outside Shenyang in northeast China. And that's where I met a guy named Yu Kexin, who was presented as the sort of model Maoist peasant. And after getting a briefing where officials talked about how great everything was in the commune, we were able to have lunch with him, a small group. We broke into small groups, and I went to his house, and we had this meal, which for me remained perhaps the most memorable moment of the whole trip, because it was a rare, kind of somewhat less supervised person-to-person encounter in somebody's home. So 20 years later, as CNN's Beijing bureau chief, I decided to retrace where I went on that 1973 trip and use it as a way to see how China had changed in the intervening 20 years. And I managed to track Yu Kexin down, and I discovered that he was now running a tractor factory. He'd moved out of the home where we'd had that lunch, and he was in a nice apartment. He had a television set. He was clearly doing well and was clearly a beneficiary of the market-oriented reforms that Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping had introduced beginning in the late 1970s. But as soon as the local officials who'd arranged this trip were out of earshot, Yu Kexin confessed that almost everything I'd seen on that 1973 visit had been an illusion. He told me that, in fact, conditions in the commune then were terrible, that he was lucky to get meat to eat once a month, and that the meal I had so enjoyed had actually been trucked in by local officials the day before just to impress the foreigners. And to me, I think this whole episode underscores a central theme in any discussion about the history and the experience of foreign correspondents in China, and that is the challenge of finding the truth in a vast, complicated history, with a vast, complicated country with a long history of suspicion and distrust of outsiders, run by an authoritarian and highly secretive communist party. This, by the way, is Joseph Kahn, who in the 1990s and early 2000s covered China for first the Wall Street Journal and then the New York Times, and is today the executive editor, in other words, the editor-in-chief at the Times, and is one of more than 100 people whose interviews make up the heart of Assignment China. The stakes in this discussion couldn't be higher, because over the decades, reporters for the American media, like in this photo, Evan Osnos of The New Yorker, have played a critical role, as Clay mentioned. Coverage has profoundly influenced the views of China in the United States and has influenced American government policies towards China. Moreover, the reach of U.S. news organizations like the TV networks, CNN, the New York Times, the wire services like the Associated Press, has meant that such coverage has also had a disproportionate impact in shaping how people beyond the United States understand or misunderstand China. For many consumers of news, however, the way the information that they read in newspapers or online or listen to on the radio or see on television actually gets there remains a mystery. Few people understand what goes into the actual reporting, assembling, and transmitting of news. This, by the way, is John Pomfret, who in 1989, when this photo was taken, was a correspondent for the Associated Press, and he's standing in Tiananmen Square listening to two of the student protest leaders, and he later became a very distinguished correspondent in China for the Washington Post. But as any journalist will agree, the process decisively shapes any news report. And so today, with China emerging as a global superpower and its relations with the U.S. more strained than at any time in the last 50 years, I would argue that understanding the people who have covered China for the American media and how they have done so is absolutely crucial to help everybody understand the news that you are watching or reading or listening to. And providing that understanding is the central goal of Assignment China. The story of the journalist in assignment China begins with the triumph of Mao Zedong's Communist Revolution in 1949, at which point virtually all American and other Western journalists were forced to leave the country. Indeed, when Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic in Tiananmen Square on October 1st, 1949, not a single American journalist was there to witness the event. For most of the more than 3 decades that followed, American reporters had little choice to report on China from outside the mainland, generally in the then British colony of Hong Kong. The China Watchers, as they became known, relied primarily on the official Chinese media, which they monitored religiously for clues. One of them was Bernard Kalb, who sadly just died recently at the age of 100, who was based in Hong Kong and then first for the New York Times and then throughout most of the 1960s and beyond for CBS News. And he offers a little bit of a sense of what that experience was like.
How do we get information about China? We got bits and pieces. We read everything we could. We put the mosaic of pieces together and try to extract some narrative about what was happening in China. But this was bits and pieces journalism.
It was, in fact, a frustrating beat, especially when China was convulsed with upheavals like Chairman Mao's great proletarian cultural revolution of the late 1960s, which American correspondents couldn't see for themselves. It was, in fact, not until Richard Nixon's historic trip in February of 1972 that the door began to open. At that time, China had been cut off for so long that many journalists, even network heavyweights like CBS News correspondent Dan Rather, felt it was a little bit like going into outer space.
It was a little bit the feeling we're leaving Earth and going deep into the cosmos of some distant planet.
In the wake of the Nixon trip, China did slowly become a bit more accessible, and U.S. news organizations gradually began to gain a little bit better access. This photograph shows Ted Koppel of ABC News with cameraman John Lauer in China in 1973, the year of my first visit. But it wasn't until the U.S. and China established formal diplomatic relations in 1979 that American news organizations were finally allowed to open bureaus in Beijing. The interest in China back then was enormous. When Deng Xiaoping, who had by then made himself the country's senior leader, visited the United States, the image of him wearing a cowboy hat at a rodeo in Texas cemented this notion of Deng as kind of the cuddly communist and China as an attractive strategic and economic partner for the United States. The economic reforms that Deng initiated around this time heightened this perception, which was fueled by the cascade of stories the newly arrived correspondents did about the changes underway. Jim Laurie opened the ABC News Bureau.
If you go back and you look at the programming on ABC and NBC and CBS in 1979, that is very much reflected. China opening up. Every little innovation that occurred in the late 70s that were part of the reform program that Deng was outlining were seized upon. The first private restaurant, the first private car, the first of this, the first. It was all a series of firsts.
What followed were several decades when the People's Republic became increasingly accessible to American and other foreign journalists, although there were always obstacles and limitations. When I became CNN's first Beijing bureau chief in 1987, for example, the official regulations required that you get permission from the authorities 10 days in advance for any travel outside Beijing, like this trip I took with my camera crew to Tibet in 1988. Plus, you had to be accompanied everywhere you went by a government minder. Moreover, contact with ordinary Chinese remained difficult. Melinda Liu, a Chinese-American who opened the Newsweek Bureau, because she was ethnically Chinese, was able to dress as a local and escape the scrutiny of security personnel and mingle with ordinary citizens. But these kinds of encounters were often fraught. The New York Times' Fox Butterfield, who was the first Times correspondent in Beijing, met a woman who was willing to speak candidly with him about sexual values in China. He did a story, and he did not identify her by name and tried to disguise her identity, but the authorities figured out who she was, and she was put in jail. Richard Bernstein, who opened the Time magazine bureau, did a story about a prison journal he got a hold of that had been written by a dissident who'd been jailed for his activities around the Democracy Wall protests in Beijing in 1978 and 1979. Bernstein was hauled in for questioning by the police, and the dissident, who had been sentenced to a 3-year prison term, had his sentence increased to 11 years. Still, Deng Xiaoping persisted with his reforms, which included greater engagement with the Western media. In 1986, for example, he gave an interview to Mike Wallace of the CBS News 60 Minutes program. It was the first time a Chinese leader had sat down with a Western TV journalist. But these reforming trends alarmed Communist Party hardliners, who made repeated attempts to roll the reforms back by mounting periodic campaigns against so-called bourgeois liberalization. Dorinda Elliott, who arrived in 1986 for Newsweek, tried to interview a farmer in the countryside about one such bourgeois liberalization campaign, an experience which gives a good sense of the challenges journalists faced then.
And as a journalist, this was firstly no easy thing. You had to go through the foreign affairs office of the province, and then it got down to the town level, whatever. By the time I got to the village, I probably had 20 Chinese officials, Communist Party officials following me. And I remember going into this farmer's house, and I'm trying to have a conversation with this farmer in Chinese, but in the meantime, like 15 or 20 government officials come into this tiny little house with me, and the entire village is basically looking through the window into the house. The family of farmers are totally terrified, have no idea what's going on. So I turn to this woman and I say, so tell me, what do you think about the bourgeois liberalization campaign and what's going on? And she says, she looks absolutely terrified, doesn't know what to say, and she says, well, the reason that we're supposed to support bourgeois liberalization is because, and you could see the officials saying, no, you're supposed to be opposing bourgeois liberalization. And, I felt like, oh my God, what have I done to this poor farmer?
I think all of us who worked as journalists in China had moments like that over the years. In any event, in 1989, with the huge pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and elsewhere, that became a watershed year, and not only for Chinese politics, it was also a critical moment in the history of journalism. And it was due to an accident of history, the fact that the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, was going to travel to Beijing to put an end to the 30-year-long Sino-Soviet dispute, which in the late 1960s almost led to war. This was going to be the crowning diplomatic achievement of Deng Xiaoping's career, and the Chinese authorities were eager for coverage. So they granted permission to CNN and other broadcasters to bring in satellite dishes and other elaborate, expensive transmission equipment with the idea of televising the visit live. But then the students, protesting students, literally stole the stage on which the Sino-Soviet summit was supposed to take place. So the morning of Gorbachev's arrival, we at CNN had gotten permission to do a live broadcast from the rostrum above the Mao portrait. It's unprecedented because the idea was the welcoming ceremony was going to be there. But in fact, these were the kinds of scenes that we saw, and because all the transmission equipment was set up, this is what we were able to broadcast live. And these live broadcasts, and today, when it's possible to transmit live video from almost anywhere with an iPhone, it's easy to lose sight of just how unprecedented it was. But these broadcasts captured attention around the world, and they presented a picture of China completely different from the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party had long sought to impose on foreign journalists. But on the night of June 3rd and 4th, the People's Liberation Army was ordered into the center of Beijing to crush the protests. The following day, from the balcony of the Beijing Hotel, a cameraman for CNN named Jonathan Scher and a photographer for the Associated Press named Jeff Widener captured a moment that became one of the iconic images of our times.
Another cameraman said, "Hey, look at that guy in front of the tank." And I looked at it and said, "Oh my God," zoomed in on it and started videotaping it. And they were trying to scare him off by shooting over his head. Well, shooting over his head was basically at where our position was. It was the 5th floor, the 4th floor, whatever balcony we were on, but the bullets were so close you could hear them whizzing by. And at that point, we just locked the camera down. It was just too dangerous. There were bullets ricocheting around.
So I'm just like waiting for them to get shot and holding the focus on them, waiting, and it's too far away, and this is too far away, it's too far away. And I looked back at the bed, and I had that lens doubler, which would make my 400 and 800. And I have to think, do I gamble? Do I go back to the bed? Maybe I lose the shot, or do I just shoot this wider? So I took a chance, and I ran to the bed, got it, put it on the camera, opened the aperture up all the way. 1, 2, 3 shots.
And this was the image that resulted. An image of the man in front of the tank became a symbol of a crackdown which shocked the world, and the coverage from Tiananmen produced a sea change in American perceptions of China. As the 1990s arrived, the American press corps remained focused on the sort of bitter legacy of 1989 and the repression that still enveloped Beijing. In such a climate, many reporters didn't initially appreciate the moves by Deng Xiaoping, which started in 1992 with what became known as his Southern Tour, where he went to the more economically open southern provinces to try to revive his program of economic reform. But the attention of the American press corps swiftly shifted to chronicling the dramatic economic, social, and even political changes produced by the boom. The new atmosphere also led to a significant improvement in conditions for foreign correspondents. It became much easier to travel, and local officials were much more accessible. Instead of chasing us away, they often asked foreign journalists for advice about how to attract foreign investment. By the late 1990s, the China beat was entering what Keith Richburg of the Washington Post described as its golden age.
This is some amazing transformation that's going on in China right now. Beijing was kind of really exploding as it went from being this kind of difficult place for correspondents to live to being actually kind of fun.
It was, in fact, an exhilarating period. The Chinese economy was turning into the manufacturing hub for the world, and American journalists were able to dig into Chinese society in ways that had previously been difficult, if not impossible, struggling with a real paradox, because one day you'd be doing a story about a jailed dissident, and the next day you'd be covering the opening of the world's largest airport or interviewing another Chinese entrepreneur who'd become a millionaire. 2008 was the climax of this period when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics. In the run-up to the Games, the government lifted many long-standing restrictions on the movements and activities of foreign correspondents. In the wake of the Games, though, China's domestic political climate and its external behavior began to change. The financial crisis that rocked the West in 2008 and 2009 convinced China's leaders that the U.S. was a declining power, and the time was right for Beijing to show a more assertive face to the rest of the world, and that included in its treatment of the foreign media. For reporters, China became an increasingly tense game of cat and mouse with the authorities. Here's one of many examples. The actor Christian Bale, the star of Batman and many other movies, was in China to promote a new film. He wanted to meet Chen Guangcheng, who was a blind lawyer who'd become known for his work helping the farmers in the village where he came from, and who was at that point under some kind of house arrest or detention. Bale was accompanied by CNN correspondent Stan Grant, and they tried to drive to Chen's village. But outside the village, just a few hours from Beijing, they were set upon by local security forces.
Why can I not go visit this man?
Hollywood actor Christian Bale is used to action, but this is no movie set.
We've been stopped.
Plainclothes Chinese security who would not identify themselves, determined to stop him and our crew contacting a detained human rights activist.
Watch it, Christian. Watch it. We're trying to get out of here. Once again, we've been stopped. We've been stopped right here. And as you can see, they're pushing Christian here. We're just trying to leave peacefully. We're trying to leave peacefully.
Government anger at the American press intensified in 2012 when Michael Forsyth and his colleagues at Bloomberg News produced an expose showing that relatives of then Vice President Xi Jinping, who was about to become the country's top leader, had made millions of dollars in a host of questionable businesses. At the same time, David Barboza of the New York Times used publicly available corporate documents to uncover how relatives of Premier Wen Jiabao controlled numerous companies, and it also made millions of dollars. It's interesting to hear him describe how he worked on that story.
Every time we requested a company, we found 10 more. So if you can imagine, this big chart is, you have, like even with Ping An, behind Ping An are 30 companies, and then behind those, it ends up, any company you look at is like 100 companies. I continued to map out a strategy of how to do it without setting off alarm bells, without letting people know, thinking about who was going to be translating, what I could show people, and also to go around to lawyers, accountants, bankers, and test some of the theories without giving them what I was doing, because that was too sensitive.
The stories broke new ground as examples of a new kind of investigative journalism for covering a rapidly changing China. The correspondents took advantage of China's evolution towards a more internationally engaged market-style economy to unravel complex and often hidden business deals reaching to the highest levels in the People's Republic. But retaliation from Beijing was swift. Michael Forsyth received death threats and had to leave the country. The websites of both Bloomberg News and the New York Times were blocked in China, and the reporters had trouble getting visas. Since then, China has become an increasingly challenging beat, as reporters have found themselves regularly tailed, harassed, blocked, sometimes physically assaulted. Xi Jinping's campaign to aggressively consolidate power has made conditions for reporters even more difficult. While not as bad as the Mao era, the climate for China-based correspondents, I would argue, is more restrictive now than at any time since the country began its program of economic reform and normalized relations with the United States in the late 1970s. At the same time, Xi Jinping has further tightened Communist Party control over Chinese society and changed party policies to allow him, in effect, to rule for life. High-level Chinese politics have always been opaque, secretive, and a challenge to figure out, but under Xi Jinping they become even more so. Indeed, although China is more accessible now than in the Mao years in certain ways, Xi and other leaders travel, they meet with foreign dignitaries, Xi's even gone to address the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Our knowledge of the inner workings at the pinnacle of power is arguably less than during Mao's time. And American and other foreign journalists aren't alone in being unable to penetrate this wall of secrecy. Nonetheless, American journalists have persisted in doing what they could, and surprisingly, that's been quite a lot. It's included exposing the massive campaign of repression targeting the Muslim Uyghur population in the far western province of Xinjiang. That coverage helped make Chinese government behavior in Xinjiang into a major international issue. But conditions for reporters have continued to deteriorate. In 2019, the Foreign Correspondents Club of China released its annual report in which 82% of the correspondents said they'd experienced harassment, interference, or violence while reporting, and 70% said they'd had interviews canceled due to the actions of the Chinese authorities. During the early days of COVID, access shrank even further when nearly 20 journalists for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal were expelled. Those kicked out included Chao Deng of the Wall Street Journal and Chris Buckley of the New York Times. Both of them managed to slip into Wuhan, which was the epicenter of the COVID outbreak, right at the very beginning, just as the city was being locked down. And they were able to stay in Wuhan, taking considerable risks for the duration of the lockdown, and they provided very, very important coverage about what was going on at that crucial moment. The Chinese government justified the expulsions as a response to the Trump administration's decision to cap the number of staff at 4 state-run Chinese media outlets in the United States. But the move effectively decimated the U.S. press corps in China. With just a handful of reporters there now, that has largely been having to cover China from outside the country. So in a kind of irony, a modern-day version of the art of China watching that emerged in Hong Kong in the 50s and 60s when reporters couldn't get into China has again become increasingly important. Here I want to make a brief digression to recall the work of the man generally considered in the field to have been the greatest of the China watchers, Father Laszlo Ladany. Father Ladany was a Hungarian Jesuit priest. He lived and worked in China in the 1940s and had to leave when the communists took power in 1949. After moving to Hong Kong for more than 30 years, he published a weekly newsletter called the China News Analysis. It became the Bible for multiple generations of journalists, myself included. The China News Analysis was based entirely on Father Ladany's reading and interpretation of the official Chinese media, newspapers, transcripts of radio broadcasts, and so on. He was fluent in Chinese, and he mastered the art of deciphering the real meaning behind the rhetoric, the jargon, the slogans, the obscure historical references and dubious statistics pumped out by the Chinese Communist Party. That approach to analyzing China still holds true today. Here's a tweet by Fordham University China scholar Carl Minzer, which provides a good example of how to apply such guidelines now. In this tweet, Minzer has been charting the language used in state media to refer to Xi Jinping, and specifically language using the word "at the helm" or evoking the term helmsman, which was a form of praise previously exclusively reserved for Chairman Mao as a kind of telling symbol of how Xi Jinping was tightening his grip on power. Today, however, there are new tools and resources beyond just trying to decipher what's in papers like the People's Daily. These include monitoring the Chinese internet, which despite censorship can still provide critical insights. One recent example is this New York Times piece. Times reporters collected the obituaries that were publicly published or posted since January 2019 on the official websites of the Chinese Academy of Engineering and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They discovered that while usually there were 3 or 4 obituaries every month, once the Chinese government abandoned its zero COVID policy in early December, the number of obituaries shot up dramatically. It was terrific reporting, and it provided powerful evidence that the government's official death toll did not reflect a much grimmer reality. Indeed, there are now a whole host of online publications exclusively devoted to following the Chinese internet and the Chinese media more broadly. These include, among others, What's on Weibo, which is run by a Dutch sinologist, which charts what appears in the Chinese version of Twitter. There's Cynicism, run by American China expert Bill Bishop, which offers summaries, analysis, and links to major Chinese media stories. There's the China Media Project, which does something similar. Also increasingly important has been commercially available satellite imagery. Using satellite imagery was absolutely crucial to documenting, uncovering and documenting the detention camps in Xinjiang. More recently, reporters used commercially available satellite images to document unusually high activity at crematoriums across China. In this case, for example, if you look on the right, you can see all the cars parked at a parking lot outside a crematorium near Beijing. And this is the same crematorium. The only difference is the picture on the left was taken at the beginning of December, and the picture on the right was taken at the end of December, and the only thing that happened in the interim was that the government ended the zero COVID policy. So it was another way in which reporters were able to use tools to get a better sense of what was really going on without actually being able to be there. In addition, we're also seeing beginning use of AI, such as this newsletter called 5 Things on China's Leaders' Minds. The newsletter uses software that can analyze web content for any keyword, sector, or individual to determine how often certain material appears. So it's a way of showing what issues are preoccupying Chinese leaders and also what they want people within the system, who are the main consumers of the official media, to think about. Moreover, China's growing international involvement is also providing opportunities for reporters. One recent example was this long Wall Street Journal article about problems in many high-profile Chinese construction projects that are part of China's widely publicized Belt and Road Initiative. The reporters talked to people in Peru, Angola, Uganda, and elsewhere. Interestingly, although they requested comment from Chinese embassies, companies, and the central government, but none were willing to speak with them. And this, I think, cuts to the heart of one issue that has long affected American and other foreign news coverage of China, and that's the continuing unwillingness of the Chinese authorities to engage in meaningful ways with reporters. As you can see from this example, and there are countless others, correspondents generally do try hard to get the Chinese perspective, but their requests for interviews or access are routinely rebuffed. The upshot is that many stories are not likely to contain as extensive or nuanced a portrayal of Chinese views as might otherwise be the case. But by and large, that is not the fault of the reporter. Nor is it a function of bias, despite the claims one often hears from Beijing and its supporters about how the Western media is biased, that it's anti-China, that it has an agenda to defame China, and so on. In fact, as I've indicated, reasonable, responsible reporters want to get input from all sides. But they have to do their jobs, and they'll end up putting a story out with whatever information they are able to get by the time their deadline rolls around. And if the Chinese side won't engage, it has only itself to blame. But there's another reason for the tension between the American/Western press and the Chinese authorities, and that has to do, I think, with the nature of journalism itself. At its finest, the role of journalism in the U.S. or in the West more generally has been to shine a light in dark places, to hold the powerful accountable, to be a voice for the voiceless. And that's true of a journalist whether or not he or she is in Washington or London or Cape Town or Moscow or Beijing. And that's why so many governments don't like the press. And in fact, it's worth emphasizing this is not just a Western notion. In Asia, for example, you have a relatively free press in South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan. You had it in Hong Kong until China imposed its draconian national security law. You even see it in the Philippines, where my old friend and longtime colleague from CNN days, Maria Ressa, won the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to report on issues the authorities there didn't want covered. So in my view, it's not a function of the reporters being anti-China. Indeed, I would say that most of the journalists who appear in Assignment China really like China. For them, China was a passion. It was a calling. I know in my own case that was true. I was entranced with China long before I became a journalist. In fact, I became a journalist because I was interested in China. And back in the mid-1970s, when I was starting out and it was difficult for Americans to get to China, becoming a journalist seemed to be one of the few career paths that might offer somebody a chance to spend time inside China. In fact, most journalists who do spend time in China, who take the time to learn Chinese and study the country and agree to live there and bring their families there, despite all the difficulties, they don't do that because they hate China. They do it because they like China. They're fascinated by China and they want to experience it. Indeed, I think one of the most unfortunate consequences of the sharp decline in American media access to China is that the ability of reporters who are basically positively disposed towards the people of China to travel around the country, to talk to folks, witness for themselves what's going on, has been so severely limited. Being there is the essential foundation of good journalism, and that has become harder and harder to do. In addition, these days, even when travel for the few remaining reporters on the ground in the People's Republic is possible, they also face a population which has heard for several years now from the state-run press that the reporters are bad guys, that they're spies, that you should be wary of them. And so they'll often find that even if the authorities aren't preventing people from talking to them, many people are themselves hostile to engage with reporters. So the result is that more and more of the coverage is becoming focused on the tensions and conflicts driving China and the U.S. apart, since the official statements and the diplomatic back and forth or the military announcements and so on are easier to follow and report on. But what's increasingly missing is the ability of journalists to convey the richness and complexity of the world's most populous nation, to convey a sense of shared humanity that I think is also crucial to understand, and especially crucial at this time as the U.S. and China lurch ever closer to confrontation. So let me stop there. Thanks for your attention, and happy to hear your thoughts and get your questions.